Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. Our clock has already started, so we're going to get right to it. It's like making me anxious already. So we are here to have a conversation about innovative financing strategies, and I'll just take a moment to put that in a little bit of context for you, and then get into a discussion with our panel. So I think we know almost more than we ever knew before that racial and economic equity are just critical issues in our society today. And at JFF, we've been working for almost 4 decades to create a society where economic advancement is available to all on an equitable basis. But despite the best efforts of all of us in this room and all of us at this conference, right, we aren't moving the dial a whole lot because there are just deep structural inequities that exist. And finance is one of the areas where we have really decided to do a deep dive over the next couple of years and really see, how can we, truly start to move the dial around equity by taking kind of a bigger view of finance, by asking the harder questions and to testing out new solutions and with partners like on the panel today. Back in June at our Horizons conference, we had a great session about this where we really debated kind of both the excitement about these strategies and some of the caution about the strategies and how to ensure that they are not misused and actually deployed in ways that create deeper divides in outcomes. So I think it's a very timely debate. I encourage you to look at the on-demand session on our website if you didn't catch that, but we want to really dig into this today. And so I am joined by Scott Pulsipher, who is the president of Western Governors University, Hanna Jamal from Social Finance, Tess Michaels from Stride Funding, and Karthik Krishnan from MentorWorks. And so just to start maybe with some kind of level setting. So I know Tess and Karthik, you both use ISAs as a vehicle. And maybe if you could just start by telling us a bit kind of about your approach and about your work in general. And so Tess, let's start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all so much for being here. So at Stride, I actually founded Stride from a student-first perspective. I was a graduate student at Harvard, fairly struck by the sticker price, in the same boat as a lot of my peers, thinking about ways to really think about what outcomes look like post-graduation and what funding options existed that were more affordable or more flexible. And at that moment in time, income share agreements were intellectually really fascinating, but there was only one provider in the university space, and they required university endowments to fund the product. And so it was difficult for students to actually be able to get access. So we started Stride as a direct-to-student offering in the university space, really focused around students in high-impact programs like healthcare, like nursing and STEM programs, but have expanded quite a bit since. And now we're really an end-to-end provider of both income share agreements and deferred tuition agreements in the university market, so both on campus and online, where we partner with OPMs and providers in that space, as well as in the alternative education space, so with your upskilling and reskilling boot camps. And it's been amazing to just see outcomes across the spectrum of education and growth, especially coming out of COVID, in both online and alt-ed. So that's really where we play.
Hi, I'm Karthik Krishnan, CEO and co-founder of MentorWorks. I come at this from a higher education perspective in the sense that I'm actually a professor of finance, so still recovering from that. And somehow I find myself in the income share agreement space. And that's a funny story for another time. But the disparities that you talked about, I literally felt in the classroom. And my wife actually teaches at a state school in Massachusetts. And you sit in a cafeteria and the discussion invariably turns to student loans. How do you pay it off? When do you pay it off? And so, MentorWorks operates in very similar spaces as Tess does. We work to fund students with income share agreements, income contingent payment for skills-based programs. We also take a kind of a more holistic approach. We call it a fund and support model, where we work with the student to get them into the programs that they desire, get the education, but then also work with them to support them all the way to a career pathway. So we prepare them for the job market. We work with them on things like resume and all that. We have digital content, we have individual support, and then interface them with employers. Because at the end of the day, what you're trying to get in an education is not the education itself for the most part. You're trying to get outcomes in terms of employment, in terms of jobs. And we did not want to kind of stop at the financing. We want to kind of create the whole, go all the way with our students, and it's in our interest to do so. So kind of, we come at this, what we call a fund and support model. ISA is a tool for us. It's a part of the full equation, and we want to solve that.
And so, Hanna, I know at Social Finance, you all have been at this for a while and kind of looking at a variety of different tools and approaches. So maybe give us a bit of that landscape.
Sure. So for folks who aren't familiar, Social Finance is an impact investing and advisory nonprofit. We work across public and private sectors to develop outcome-based financing tools that aim to measurably improve lives. And we started out with a model called the Social Impact Bond, which deploys impact investment capital to scale up social programs that have a track record of success, and pairs that with a commitment from a payer, often a government, to repay those investors based on the outcomes that are achieved. Over the past 10 years or so, we've actually been expanding our toolkit of outcome-based financing strategies, and in 2019 launched the Career Impact Bond, which is a comprehensive model for financing education and training that embodies a lot of those same principles or ideas. So again, the upfront costs are covered by impact investors, and students only make payments based on their own career outcomes and success via an income share agreement model. And there are comprehensive student supports that are provided as well, because we know those are really important to ensuring student success in the long term. So we raised a $50 million impact investment vehicle called the Up Fund to support that strategy, and have launched 3 career impact bonds serving over 1,000 students in programs that are focused on IT and diesel mechanic technician training. We've also got others in the pipeline focusing on other key industries, including green energy and the future of work in high growth industries. At the same time as we're doing sort of the Career Impact Bond and ISA work, we're also raising a $100 million graduate school loan fund for Dreamers to enable them to pursue professional degrees. So under the current legislation, Dreamers, aka DACA recipients, can live and work in the United States legally. They can go to public school here, but they can't access any Title IV funding to go to college or grad school. So we've partnered with an organization called the Dream.us, which is co-founded by Don Graham. It's the nation's largest college access and success program for undocumented youth. And we've created a loan fund that essentially offers loans to DACA recipients to be able to earn master's degrees in fields that have really strong labor market outcomes. Because this is a debt instrument, it's not an ISA. There's different risks and considerations involved, but we want to make sure that the debt that these students are taking on, that they're able to repay based on the careers that they would get after they graduate. And so in that way are really focused on, again, the sort of the career success and outcomes for those students, and by making this financing available to them. So hopefully it gives you a flavor of the types of tools we work on. Again, we've got different types of instruments, debts, ISAs, but all of them are focused, again, on enabling access for students who don't have access to financing, either because of their income status or immigration status, and also designing them in a really student-friendly way that ensures the best outcomes for students long-term.
And Scott, I know we've had some great conversations over the years about how you're thinking about deploying different strategies within WGU. So maybe give us a sense of kind of how you're thinking about innovation as part of that suite of services.
Sure. I think first and foremost, there was simply this recognition that the student finance complex as it currently exists in the U.S. is not very student-centric. So you could probably just remove the student part of that and just call it the higher education finance complex. And it's woefully complex for the individual who's actually trying to decipher how, in fact, do I solve the funding challenge that I have for what is an ever-increasing cost of education. I notice actually Beth Akers here in the room, but I would just highlight to this point is like Beth Akers and Matt Chingos did some work several years ago where in surveying those that actually held federal student loans, I think in that survey, if I'm not mistaken, like 28% of them didn't even know they had a federal loan. And you're kind of like, that's unnerving, and it should be unnerving to everybody that there's this mechanism by which institutions are in fact encouraging their students so that they can matriculate to apply for something they didn't even understand the terms of that they applied for. And that's pervasive across the sector. And so we just recognized that there was a need to better align the financing models of education with the outcomes that we're actually striving to achieve for the individuals that we're intending to serve. And so first and foremost, we just, working within that which already exists, we started with trying to simply just increase transparency. This was a big part of our conversation at a panel yesterday, is that individuals, for them to make a choice, it needs to be informed choice. And so they need to not only understand what is the cost of the education you're intending to pursue, what are the outcomes that you're trying to achieve as a result of that, but then what is the right way in which you should fund that. And certainly free money is the best money, so all the aid programs and scholarships, et cetera, can you achieve. But even when it comes to borrowing, one of the best things that we've done in this regard is for the last 7 years have been now into our 8th year of our responsible borrowing initiative at WGU, which simply is how do we really help you as an individual understand the full cost of attending WGU so you only take financing for that which you truly need. And in doing that, we just help those students make better choices. So over those 7 years, we've reduced the borrowing per graduate by about 32 to 34%, which actually amounts to about $7,000. It declined from over nearly $21,000 to now about $14,000 per graduate. And that number is half the national averages, where most undergraduate completers are basically at $30,000 now of debt per undergraduate. And I think that for us is just simply saying, the individual needs to be in greater control of how they're making decisions about not only the program they pursue, but also how do they finance that program. And these programs, we know why they primarily exist for 2 reasons. One is because the cost has been out of control for the last 35 years. But second, it was actually intended to help address affordability barriers that exist for so many Americans. Like these, whether it's dreamers in one particular unique use case, but in reality, from low-income backgrounds that has intersectionality with individuals of color, like affordability is still one of the biggest barriers to accessing high-quality education. And so we need to be thinking about financing innovation in a way to start removing those barriers, but doing so in a way that better aligns with outcomes. Because at the end of the day, a student who starts who doesn't complete, and if you only end up with debt, you're actually worse off than had you never started, because you're no better readied for economic success, and now you're saddled with a debt vehicle that you can't even bankrupt out of. And so we think there are better ways to do that.
I like the point about people not knowing that they are taking out loans. So my husband is finishing his degree currently, and he came to me one day with this thing he got in the mail. He's like, "Look, I got a scholarship." And I read it. I was like, "This is a loan." So my focus group of 1, I can tell you, it's very deceiving.
That's good marketing on part of the debt company, I suppose. It's like, "Hey, look, you've been awarded." Actually, I was just thinking about that funny notion of when you are approved for your loan, they actually "Oh, you've been awarded." You're like, let's talk about that later, whether you've actually been awarded.
So be on the lookout for that. But I like the point about informed choice, right? So just wondering, the rest of the panel, how do you think about that, in your work and in your models, and how are you helping to make that more of a reality? Because I think there's a huge gap right now, across the board in terms of good information that's flowing to consumers.
So I think one of the things we really think about is transparency on the front end. Again, we both have a B2B model where we work directly with the institutions, but also a direct-to-student model where at that point in time, what you realize is financial literacy, as Scott alluded to, is incredibly low. And what's really important is for us as providers, especially if we're impact-oriented, how do we really help students understand their options, right? And whether it's an ISA or any other financing product, it's a menu option for students. And so for us, part of the process we do on the front end is we have tools like calculators where students can compare their costs and compare it across different financial products that they have options, especially in the private loan market, and really see what do those monthly payments look like, what does duration look like, what does total payments look like. We also created scholarship databases because just like Scott mentioned earlier, free money is the best type of money, and oftentimes students don't know what they have access to, first and foremost, even before looking at private options. And beyond that, really understanding products like income share agreements that are different, really making sure that comprehension is high. So we have quizzes and tools to really make sure that even before students sign a contract with us, they really understand what they're getting into and what the structure looks like. Because giving away money is easy, getting it back is the harder piece. And it's really important to help students through persistence in the program and what do those outcomes look like on the back end so that they really understand both the financial decisions they're making, but also the career decisions that come along with that.
So, and I totally agree with what Tess said, and we do a lot of that, having calculators, and we just released a new free financial literacy module, which goes beyond just this education finance piece. But I think the philosophy that we take is, everybody finds it hard to compare something with zero. Like, you don't want to compare an ISA to zero or free money or like, what's your alternative? What's your next alternative? And usually people understand best when thinking about what does this compare with. And that's really embedded in the way that we talk about our ISAs is what is this as compared to the next best option you have. In a certificate program, maybe you don't have access to Title IV, so you have private loans. In a Title IV, are we comparing it to a plus? Are we comparing it to a subsidized or unsubsidized direct loan? But whatever it is, right, giving the students the optionality to, first of all, to understand what the comparison is, and then allowing them to change those comparisons as they would like, to suit their taste or to kind of suit their personal situation, I think goes a long way. We've literally seen like the light bulb go off in front of a student and think, oh, now I get it, because you say this is what it is on ISA, you say this is what it's on a loan. I get that, and that really helps.
Yeah, I'll just double down on the transparency point, and I think we've created in our career impact bond model something that we call the Student Bill of Rights, which we actually ask all the stakeholders involved to sign on to, so not just the students, but training providers, impact investors. And it essentially is a document that provides that transparency around what the payment terms are, but also what the students' rights are under these programs, and what services they have access to. And I think that kind of helps both inform them about their options, but also what resources are available should they run into challenges or they need support along the way. And that's something, again, that I think is important for everyone who's involved to be aware of. And then on the Dreamers Loan Fund side, I mean, we spend a lot of time investing in the financial education for prospective borrowers and thinking about exactly as Scott was saying, what is the sort of ROI of this graduate degree program, and how do you think about taking on debt to finance that? And nothing against, I actually have a master's in anthropology, nothing against them, it's a fantastic degree, but maybe you don't want to borrow $100,000 to get a master's in anthropology. And so thinking about how do you sort of support students in thinking about that calculus and sort of what is the return on investment and what would it mean to be able to take on debt to be able to finance this, knowing that my future earnings are going to allow me to reasonably manage that debt service, I think is a really important part of being sort of a responsible lender for those types of programs.
So I think that this is like a really interesting topic, right? Particularly like in DC right now, right? And I feel that the narrative needs to shift a bit, right? I feel like the conversation often like quickly goes too far to the protection side, and while I'm all for protection, I think we also need to push on innovation. And I was struck a couple months ago, I felt the New York Times had two articles almost like 3 days apart, like one that was like pretty positive about these approaches, and then one that was like not so positive. And it made me think, like, do they realize they're kind of talking about the same thing in both of these articles? And so I'm just curious, like, how, particularly as we think about equity and driving more equitable outcomes, like, how would each of you push to like shift the narrative on this? Like, if you were talking to a group of senators, like, what's the case that you would make for promoting this? And let's go down. Karthik, let's start with you.
I think my top 2 points, I'll have a lot of talking points, but I should not go all the way down. But my top 2 points would be First of all, when you're financing education, you're buying the option for a career outcome. You're not buying a career outcome, and definitely in many cases, you want to take a coding school, yes, but you really want the job. Any other type of financing, you're really buying the product. You buy a car, you get the car. You buy a house, you get a house. You know exactly what you're getting. And so linking the cost of a education to the outcome of an education is what we're trying to do here. I think that's one. I think the other piece of this is, if you kind of think about, and I have nothing against loans here, there are contexts when the loans are better, contexts when the ICs are better. But from a purely ex ante, a priori perspective, who do you want to help out the most when somebody goes out and gets an education and graduates? My guess is those people who are, for whatever reason, not doing well in the job market and not having an income. How do you help them? Well, by making payment linked to the ability to pay is the simplest way to do it, right? And if you kind of think about it, an income share agreement, at least the way we think about it, is a much more progressive instrument, because as your income goes down, on a loan, the percentage of income you pay is actually ramping up, whereas literally flat and then goes down, income share agreement. So we have graphics kind of illustrating that, but it's a much more progressive instrument. So those are 2 points I would make.
Yeah. I think on top of that, when you look at populations that we're supporting, I came from a family where both of my parents were immigrants, and oftentimes what you see with underrepresented populations is they're averse to debt and they're looking for alternative solutions. And I think that, oftentimes something that has always struck me when I was looking at different loan options was that most private loans, 92% of undergraduate private loans, require cosigners. And COVID has only amplified the effect that a lot of folks who may have had guarantors in the past just don't have access to that support. And that's one of the things that, what we are all pushing the narrative around is income share agreements are focused on future outcomes. And so therefore you can underwrite without looking at a student who may have a thin credit file or may not have access, again, to that family support. And that is something that definitely helps populations that I think we're all really focused on supporting. And then on the back end, if you have providers like Stride and like MentorWorks that are really focused on wraparound support, that only goes down to double down on really driving strong results for especially populations that need that additional support beyond just the classroom setting. So,
but just from a structural standpoint, I don't think we're actually dealing with all the realities of what exists in the federal student aid system that exists today. The FAFSA application alone, there's pretty good data and research that's been done about how structurally discriminatory that is against individuals from low-income backgrounds, which then has high intersectionality with individuals of color. So that's one challenge already. And so one of the principles I remember from our Amazon days, if you take a very not self-service approach, but you take a very tech-first automated way to do that, a different way to approach that is that what are the things that you can do for that individual so that they don't have to do it for themselves? And if you think of the complex way by which you determine eligibility is like, are you in a program that meets all the eligibility requirements, at an institution that meets all the eligibility requirements, and then you're a person who meets all these eligibility requirements. If all of those are already known just by the person getting admitted to a program that is at an institute that is eligible, then why don't we just do it for them? Rather than saying, oh, you have to give us all this FAFSA information, everything else, and it's got 27 gajillion steps to it with 400 different points of data that you have to give us. So it's, I think, easier to apply for a mortgage through Rocket Mortgage than it is through FAFSA. And so that's one issue that they are doing good work at simplifying FAFSA. They've shown that. Now, having said that, so much of the disparate outcomes that are being experienced are not, in fact, access to aid. It's actually in the progress and persistence and outcomes. Such that then, even though the debt per individual, if you're an individual of color, it may not be as high as others, but they're much more higher rate are in forbearance, a higher rate actually are not being repaid, a higher rate are actually defaulted on, et cetera. And why? Because in fact, many of these are not persisting, progressing, and completing at the same rates as those from higher income categories or those who are white. And so if you're privileged, this is working just fine. If you're not, it's not working so well, such that the outcomes from a debt financing model are disproportionately impacting households of color. You're like, that's not a good thing. That seldom has to do with the access to the aid. It has more to do with the process by which they're actually going through it is not working as well for them as it is for others. One last point, if I may make on this point, is that I would at least offer that the federal student aid system today is designed around one product and one product only, a bachelor's degree. And that is not keeping pace with what is changing in the education to work life cycle. And so you already heard from the others here on the panel as it relates to you now have micro-credentials, you have apprenticeships, you have internships, you have work provided or employer-provided workforce training. Like you have all these other things that in fact actually can lead to and often do lead to really good outcomes from an income or economic mobility based upon the investment level. None of that is eligible for federal aid models. And so you're already forced to, in these non-degree offerings, you're already forced to develop alternative models because they can't access the federal system. Meanwhile, we as taxpayers are being asked to finance free options, expanding Pell, everything else, but there's no accountability around actually improving the outcomes of that degree pathway. You're like, this has to work for more people. Otherwise, debt is probably the worst way to finance something where you have a very uncertain outcome. Debt is really good when you have a certain outcome. In fact, all of you startups who are making tons of money, growing your revenue like crazy and profitable, you should never take equity financing because your outcomes are pretty darn certain. Equity works so well in venture because the outcomes are so uncertain that you don't have downside risk. But if you have downside risk, debt is a pretty bad vehicle. And yet that's the only thing we've really used as a blunt force instrument to financing education.
I like the points about kind of the free college debate, the Pell debate, the we owe a training debates, and I feel that one big problem is that those conversations are rarely connected or kind of had like in unison, and I would put the kind of ISA debate in that picture as well. So a lot of work yet to be done. So maybe to take like the counter narrative for a minute, right? And I know that some folks are concerned that students of color kind of get not as good contract terms as white students. And so just curious, how all of you are like seeing that or not in your data and how you think about that in your work.
Yeah, I can start here. We actually have done a number of reports on this. And, with our population samples, I don't think we ever tried in any way, but as we kind of funded students, we saw a lot of low-income individuals gravitating to this option. We saw a lot of individuals who have seen the student-led debt approach gravitating towards the ISA option. Just as by way of background, we have funded everybody from like 25 years to 59 years. We have funded people without credit history. We have funded people who took time off, came back to the workforce, and so on. And in many cases, they didn't have pristine credit scores, to your point. So the data suggests, our data suggests, you can actually design a ISA program that creates more equity. In our model, we found, for example, in our sample of ISA folks, on average, minority students have the same terms as non-minority students. Women and men, same terms. In average, minority students are, in our sample, 7%, paying 7% fewer months of payments and taking 4% more deferment months. So it's actually helping them take a breather, get some space before they start making those payments. Also, in our sample, we are finding the origination to kind of job income increase to be about 217%, which is a pretty reasonable increase by any metric. And that number is actually slightly higher for minority students. We are finding that in our sample, the gender gap of the income disparity between men and women is at 90%. So women earn 90% of what men earn, whereas the national average is 82%. So, I mean, we don't see it. I mean, we see that this can be an instrument that can create more equity and help a lot of folks who would otherwise not be helped in a fixed payment model.
Well, I was only going to highlight what I think is there are analogies seen in the pandemic as it relates to its overall impact on individuals of color, low-income households. I think you see a similar pattern today where ISAs have been used pretty aggressively in somewhat, which is they're a financing option for programs that have underrepresentation in terms of enrollment. And that's even true in higher ed institutions that have provided for engineering or STEM degrees where you have lower than desired representation of students of color, low income backgrounds, et cetera, so that they can certainly appear discriminatory. However, I think it's notable that, there's one other thing about that, which is there is a moral hazard, which is if you're only willing to do contingent income share financing for high earning program pathways, whether they're a degree or not, you could argue that, well, that's going to bring capital that wants double-digit rates of return versus federal aid models, which have single-digit rates, or in social finance's case, like concessionary rates of return, impact capital. It's like you saw a flood of private equity backing these ISA vehicles that were trying to find, hey, where are those pretty high rates of guaranteed income returns? Let's go provide this financing for that, and sure enough, it works really well. However, then when you look at enrollment in most of those, you have underrepresentation significantly, and you're kind of guaranteeing outcome at a much higher cost to the individual than what they could finance it with aid. Such that if that's the only narrative out there, you can see the moral hazards of financing. But it's this, meaning those hazards exist everywhere. It's the same with leasing a car. Like, it costs you a lot more money to lease a car than it does to buy it and finance it. So those exist everywhere. What I will note is that there are great organizations like the three colleagues up here, especially Social Finance or Student Freedom Initiative, who are actually recognizing that this is a much better vehicle because of the income contingent nature of it, and because you can attract concessionary capital to it because of the social good and the social impact it's creating. That is a better vehicle that's better aligned with driving progress, persistence, and outcomes among those programs without any of the downside risk, meaning an individual who starts it but doesn't complete and never has the income, you don't pay anything. But if you do that with federal aid, you're going to pay something still. And so I like that. Now, that's the same approach that, at WGU, we would take that same approach because we're trying to compete with already low-cost options like Parent Plus loans, unsubsidized federal loans. Like, how do you do your best job of providing alternative financial mechanisms to increase affordability for those who need to matriculate to those programs, try to align it with ensuring that they're progressing through it, and getting the job at the end of that such that there is assurance around the income level that says this will be affordable to you, and should that not work for you, you're not going to bear any of the burden. That's a pretty darn good model. And it's going to take us a while, I think, to change the overall collective psyche on this, but I don't know any better innovation that's happening today other than doubling Pell, maybe, because it's like, at least it's free money. It's just like the lowest cost. It's like, and I'm for doubling Pell too, if in fact you can make those Pell dollars eligible for more program offerings than what they're eligible for today. But so
can I actually build, because this is kind of connecting your previous question and this question as well. Have folks seen the cartoon graphic of the crooked apple tree when you're talking about equity and justice? It's a twist on the fence and the boxes. And so you've got the apple tree and it's crooked, and you've got two kids who are the same height. One is on the side that's tilted, has easier access to the apples. One is on the other side, harder to reach the apples. So equity is thinking about customized tools, meaning you give the kids different size ladders so that they can both have equal access to the apples. And I think innovative finance can be seen as those customized tools. How do we customize this and make sure that everyone has the same access to opportunity? But there's a second image, which I think is sort of more the frame of thinking about it as justice, which is actually tools that straighten the tree. Like, how do you put a wedge against the tree and tie down one side so that you don't need customized tools anymore. Everyone can have the same size ladder and have equal opportunity to the apples. And I think what's really interesting, kind of tying together a lot of what I heard from Scott and others say on this panel, is how do we think about the role that innovative finance can play in actually straightening the tree and not just providing customized tools? And that's what I would say to the senator, and think about what is that. That's a harder task that involves other people, policymakers, legislators to get involved. But ultimately, I think that's what we are trying to strive for, is how does everybody have equal opportunity without necessarily having to keep creating these customized tools?
You certainly have that option too when it's new program offerings that are not at traditional institutions, et cetera. Those things are like 100-year-old oak trees that you're not bending that any direction. Versus the, hey, I got the sapling that I may want to start with and like see if we could do it differently than we did centuries ago.
Totally. I think one of the things that COVID really did is shift the paradigm of how individuals think about value of different educational programs, where now at the time of enrollment, the decision doesn't necessarily have to be, do I go to this bachelor's program or this bachelor's program? It could be, am I going to pursue a online program versus an on-campus program? Am I going to do a degree program versus a certificate program? If it is a certificate program, is it a traditional boot camp program versus something affiliated with a university? And each of those has different costs, and not all of these programs are created equally, and also not all of them get access to federal funding. And so then the question is for each of us, how do we really think about bringing the right capital to the mix, the right structures based on the different outcomes, and then how do we hold schools accountable so that students can make better decisions for themselves that really allow them to actually complete these programs? Because if they don't complete, regardless of the structure of the program, then it's all for naught, right? Then they're the ones who really have to shoulder most of this burden. And part of the innovation around these financing tools is to shift the burden from being solely on the students' shoulders to also being shared with schools and investors. But that's a big piece, I think, of what's been fascinating for us to see as we play across each of those different segments. And we've really seen that traditional programs aren't necessarily the only route for a lot of students, and really do help increase equity.
I'm not a pitchman for a student freedom initiative, but they're doing some pretty amazing things to, I would say, both sides of this coin, both the tools as well as how do you increase the equity in it, or the equality even in the approach. And by that, what I mean is they're actually starting with existing legacy institutions, the 100 plus HBCUs out there. But they're also adding additional things to it to increase the probability that the pathways that those students are already pursuing are going to result in the outcome, meaning that they actually gain the jobs in the fields that they need, et cetera. And that's how they're adding their InterNext programs, how they're bringing in the job and the work experience that combines with the academic credential that says these individuals are 99% of them are going to be employed because they are so prepared for and ready for it. Plus, you have an increasing demand for such individuals in the workforce that what they're applying to that model is income share model, income contingent models. They're not saying, hey, let's go get federal student aid and do that with that. They're like, no, this one actually still provides the pathway that says, we're going to increase the likelihood that that pathway results in an outcome, but we're also going to use different financing mechanisms to do it, using impact capital too, by the way, not using private equity capital to do so. And so that, to me, is a great example of how you're getting innovation across the system that is going to change the shape of the finance complex of education.
So we have 2.5 minutes left. So we're going to do a lightning round here. So my question is, if we think ahead to ASU+GSV 2026, when we are all sitting here without masks, having a great time, hopefully, how do you think the innovative finance world will be looking then? Are you optimistic about the progression over the next 5 years, pessimistic about it, and why?
From what we are seeing, I'm very optimistic that income contingent model, other forms of innovation are going to take off because I don't think there's anybody who's satisfied with status quo at this point. So I believe there's a demand and a moral imperative for change. So I'm pretty optimistic, and what we are seeing in the market, what we're seeing with acceptance from educators, from employers, and from students is that this is what we need.
I think the way that I would look at it is, I'd hope the ecosystem is better connected so that you don't have groups in silos, right? Finance providers in one silo, educational providers in another, employers in the latter side. I think, one is really connecting the dots, and then second, impact capital is where I think many of us started. When we came into the mix, we started with traditional impact investors, and then we brought national banks into funding the product. And I think over time, bringing mainstream folks into the space is the way you scale. It doesn't have to be hedge funds or private equity funds, but bringing lower cost capital that is scalable to the space, and then really doubling down on structure and connectivity is what's going to allow this to be something that's more than just an idea in the early innings of the game, and hopefully something that in 2026 is a big contender against the larger private loan industry.
I'm optimistic. I'm generally an optimist, but I'll say I think in that optimism is also a hope or a belief that some of these tools might just be rendered redundant eventually if we're successful. And so, even we talk about the Dreamers Loan Program, if Dreamers have a pathway to citizenship and can access federal funding on terms that is equally accessible and fair to all students regardless of their background, then there's no need to design a special product or tool for them. So I think I'm excited to see the diversity and evolution of financing tools and the diversity of players that are in this space, and I think that shows great promise and optimism, but really the optimistic outlook is that we'll actually have fewer, perhaps, tools because we won't need them.
I think I'd probably think of it this way, a couple markers. If I were to be optimistic, I would say we'd have education savings accounts would be one. Second, it would be a question of, do we have 25, 35%, or 40+% of total financing education from non-debt? A third one would be, what percent of an education post-secondary is free? And I personally think that the free model, we have to be careful we don't have that free model get away from itself in the sense that we end up carrying a new entitlement program that we don't know how to finance over the long term. And so I would look at markers like that to know whether I'd be an optimist or not. I would be an extreme optimist if, in fact, education savings accounts get introduced, because I think we'd be aligned with lifelong learning.
Great. Awesome. Well, please join me in thanking our panelists for this great conversation. And please follow up with them, individually if you have questions or want more information about their models. But thank you so much. Look forward to straightening the tree, as Hanna said. Thanks, everybody.